So let's get started a little bit with introductions on this side. Ashley, yes, we will provide a copy of the actual slides at the end of the day. There's quite a bit of material, so we will also give you the opportunity to ask some questions, and feel free to do so during the session. We'll collate those questions. If we have time towards the ending, we will gladly answer them. However, we do find sometimes these tend to become quite a bit of informational download. So what we would like to do is, if anything doesn't make a clear composition for yourself, or there's more questions that comes towards it, ask them outright. We'll collate those questions, provide answers the best we can. And if it's anything that you want to have a direct consultation, please do feel free to let us know. We've got some additional details towards the end of where you can get that. We'll let you know those details. But as it is 3 minutes past, and you can see the agenda, let's get started. Over to the introductions, Katie. So hi everybody, I am Cornelius Goosen. I am the head of sales and marketing for the likes of Secon Cyber. Now Secon Cyber in itself is a reseller of cybersecurity services within the UK. We've got a 25-year history within the market itself, and we also deal within consultancy. In addition to that, we have Jason Wilkes, and I'm going to leave him to give you an introduction of where he stems from and what he does.
Hi, Corey. Yeah, thanks very much. As Corey said, I'm Jason Wilkes. I'm one of the technical leads at Quod Orbis. We provide a continuous controls monitoring platform, and I guess we'll talk a little bit about that later, but not too much. Personally, sort of been in cybersecurity or information security probably since about the late or mid to late 90s. I think my first job was sort of installing sort of 64K lease lines to the internet to sort of some of the audience potentially. So then moved on sort of into sort of like a fairly technical role to begin with, then sort of moved more into sort of a compliance role. So I was a PCI QSA for my sins for a while, and also 27001 lead auditor. So the role sort of really at Quod Orbis at the moment is largely sort of helping customers and our customers sort of really kind of modernize and digitize their sort of control frameworks. And I think that sort of mix of a sort of a technical and a sort of a GRC based background sort of really helps. But fundamentally, my role is really just to sort of, as I said, sort of help our customers sort of on board their controls to help modernize and to sort of get value from our platform. Back to you, Corey.
Thank you so much, Jason. Now, as you can hear, Jason is extremely knowledgeable on all of these regulatory frameworks that have come into play. And they keep on coming. I think that's the big thing that a lot of people need to understand is, even with the likes of DORA, they are new, some are old, and there is a mixture between both of the new and old. And the big importance is to understand where this is heading. Now, when we come into this, what is DORA? So let's give you a bit of an introduction about DORA and where it comes into play. Now, as you can see, we're talking about cross-border compliance. But what does that mean? What is the context behind this? Well, DORA is the Digital Operations Resilience Act. Okay, it is an EU regulation, and it's designed to enhance the operational resilience of financial entities by addressing technological risks. A mouthful, basically meaning that we need to look at where we are managing our ICTs. Now, the importance for UK firms, despite the fact that we've gone through Brexit, is that many of the UK financial services operate cross-border. And there are collaborations with EU entities necessitating alignments with DORA. And this is going to help doing some seamless operational compliances, metrics, introductions, a lot of processes. But we're still going through a refresher course, in a sense that DORA on its own is coming in January, and we're talking on the 17th of January. Now, a lot of what Jason and myself have spoken about in prepping for this is how it's still in its infancy, but not. It's got a framework, it's got a structure, but as it enters the market, it will change as the necessities of it changes, as well as how things that are integrated with it pushes us into new areas. And this harmonization of the standards is crucial. But when it comes into play, is we're talking about the managing of information and communication technologies, those ICTs that are extremely important when we deal with the EU financial markets and the UK firms, banks, sectoral insurances, etc. The big thing in this conversation is third-party risk, and mainly why most of you are here today is where does that stem into play? Well, third-party risk is not inherently just the DORA standard. It's not just something that comes into play when we deal with DORA, okay? We know for a fact that in the UK financial sector, there are robust regulations and frameworks in play. Specifically, we talk about the Prudential Regulation Authority, or the PRA, so easily said, and the Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA. Now, those are going to be our stemming frameworks in the financial sector that is going to help with DORA in the EU sector. So they're going to talk a lot with each other, and sometimes they're going to agree with each other, and sometimes they're going to argue with each other. Now, the big thing about this is we need to build relationships within the third parties. And in those relationships, we should include regulatory monitoring, contractual safeguarding, a lot of scenario testing, because things are not always going to work out and we need to check how they're going to interact with each other. And then, of course, we need to avoid the regulatory checkbox authority strategy. Okay, so basically saying this cannot be just a checkbox exercise. We need to work through this as an integrating process. Now, operation resilience expectations. Okay, that is something that comes into play here a lot. And when it comes into play is we talk about how DORA complements the existing UK resilience guidelines. Now, that is your FCA and then your PRA from 2022 as a framework, okay? It emphasizes the continuity under adverse conditions. What does that mean? When things go wrong, it helps each other get to the best and fastest solution, okay? The big part about this is the financial firms must map their critical service, identifying the vulnerabilities that they have, and prepare to maintain operations during disruptions, whether arising from cyber threats, system failures, which is a big one going on in the market at the moment, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, especially talking about CrowdStrike. But as soon as yesterday, when Microsoft had a global outage when it came to Outlook and Teams, and we wouldn't have been here today to have a conversation if there wasn't an integrating factor that helped all the organizations work together to get us back online. Okay, so there's a big dependency on these operational resilience. Okay. Now, a big thing that comes into play as we're talking, you can hear those words, reputational damage. When these organizations and infrastructures go down, there's a big risk. Just think about it. If we couldn't have done this specific webinar today because of a Microsoft issue, nonetheless, the fact that CrowdStrike showed us how effectively everything can go down globally, that has a direct impact on your time, our time, and everybody else around the world wanting to get the knowledge, registering for the service, taking a time out during the day to get into this. Now, the case examples here would be to highlight where internally these DORA FCAs are going to talk about third-party failures resulting from these fallout sessions, be it in a small area or a propagated system that rolls out globally. And that is when we talk about third-party interaction, reputational risk, and damage. But then we also go into the financial and reputational risk, because as these things fall apart, it causes lawsuits, it causes financial losses, it results in expectations not being met by organizations, and it keeps on going. An example here is if you know anything about the production systems, if I build a car and I'm on a production line, if that car is not built on a specific timeline, it does not get completed or delivered in time by a person that expected it already 3 months ago. And if you've ordered a car in the past, you most likely know what I'm talking about. But the big part now comes into this this part about investors' confidence. Investors need a mechanism that's going to give them the transparency, Okay, and that transparency we find a lot is with compliance and operational resilience, where third parties adhere to these strict measures to make sure that everything stays on its time and path. That's the big story for us. But why now? What has suddenly pushed this whole situation into play? Well, we talk about systematic risks. We find that financial markets are relying heavily on technology today, especially cross-border services. And if those disruptions that we've seen lately in the market come into play, it doesn't just hit one region. It definitely propagates globally and causes major instances. Now, what DORA and all of these additional factors compliances framework do is they strengthen firms, they force collaboration, and they operate with interconnected financial ecosystems. So because of this integration and this strengthening of services, they make it more resilient. But as we know, things do fall apart, and this is why we've got that part about avoiding things and having reputational damage and incident response into play. Now, proactive resilience is essential for threats. And what do we mean by that? Now, as we progress in this conversation, we're going to talk about outages. And if you are not thoroughly prepared, you find that things fall apart more than in a system that has a preparation for it. This is why we talk about cyber attacks as the big one in the industry at the moment, but recently we've had it in the Philippines where natural disaster forces a stop. We've seen this in Spain. And if we don't have a fallover system, we also then get geopolitical instability because they cannot talk to each other, they cannot interlace financial transactions, even electrical transactions between two nations, water transactions between two nations, and it causes major disruptions. Once again, we had a suspected Chinese trawler sever a couple of cables. And if there wasn't an incident process in play, once again, financial sectors would not be able to do your banking transactions as they usually do. Now, as you can hear, we've got compliance and evolving regulations. And these evolving regulations follow a landscape process. Now, in the UK, we must stay attuned to what the EU regulations like DORA are doing, but as well as our own domestic updates. And this is to avoid regulatory divergence that could hinder global operations. What do I mean by that? If my UK standard is vastly different than DORA standards, I cannot work together to actually do what I need to do because they butt heads, and then I can't enforce your transactions. I cannot make sure that your necessary tasks happen when they're supposed to happen, and things fall properly apart. Now, what we talk about here is future-proofing. We're preparing for DORA right now, and then we want to reduce the risks as well as last-minute compliance efforts when it comes to cross-border requirement and intensities. So what I mean by that is if at the last minute we now try to take a big ship, a big banking financial infrastructure, and to align it to DORA, there's a high probability that we're going to end up in a bad situation and things are seriously going to fall apart. Now, Katie, can we go over to the next one where we compare a bit of DORA and UK regulations towards each other?
I think, Corey, just jumping in there. I think just jumping in there, Corey, probably what I heard a lot in there is it can probably be sort of encapsulated in trust, which is a kind of a word that we sort of hear a lot today. But I think it's kind of important to sort of realize that, and maybe just to remind ourselves is that, you know, as you sort of say, compliance is not really just a tick box exercise. You know, it's kind of more foundational than that. It's about sort of elevating standards, you know, sort of improving security and maintaining that sort of all important trust. And I guess if we think about sort of trust for a minute, you know, there's a sort of a sense of, you know, kind of confidence and reliance, you know, there's sort of typical kind of consistency, integrity, you know, demonstrating sort of competence, sort of over time, really. And from, I guess, from the sort of the DORA perspective, just putting the focus back on DORA a little bit, a lot of work was done in post the sort of the financial crash to sort of stabilize the sort of the financial sort of aspect. And I think sort of DORA and its sort of operational resilience is really looking to get the sort of supporting technology to sort of catch up with those sort of financial principles that were put in place.
Very much so. And I think the big thing for us as we step into this part about DORA versus the UK regulations, there's a bit of an alignment. And we find that the DORA and the FCA, and especially the Bank of England, they come into ununified objectives sometimes. And these cause operational crashes in the environment. Now, those are divergences come through the fact that DORA was created for the EU standard and their financial structures and how they wanted to make a best practice, if you want to call it that, function within the environment. But now we've got a bit of a divergence from the normal approaches and the scopes that we look at for it and the implementations. So now how do we essentially within our environments look at aligning best, because obviously we're going to have to do the FCA. That's our regulation. We can't stem away from it. And this is the thing where we now need to sort of look at how DORA and the UK frameworks can best play together. Now, the biggest thing that we find is DORA focuses on ICT risks. It extends operational resilience requirements to third-party technologies, etc. But in the UK regulation, we talk about the FCA and the PRA's guidelines under what you can see on the screen as PS 2416, which emphasizes the mapping of critical service, identifying vulnerabilities, and setting impact tolerances to measure acceptable downtimes to key services. So where DORA focused very much on third parties and the interactions in the environment, and which has been a key breakage of technologies, we find that in our own UK structure, we go more for impact tolerance. Now, those two can meet each other in a good shape, or it can meet each other in a bad shape. And that's the big thing between the two of these. You need to take away how can we do an overarching, overlapping measurement between the two to find the best between the two regimes. And what we find here is ICTs. We find those organizations, and we'll talk about that integration of how they work together. How do we map that in organizations? And this skill level comes into play because I can be a very matured organization and I've got this wonderful outline of my whole infrastructure, but it is on an Excel spreadsheet and it's not active. It's a very passive, manual, time-consuming auditory perspective. And then we've got other organizations which utilize tool sets which either are 100% on play or produce a lot of false positives that take a lot of time once again to go and work around. But the big thing that comes into here is the third-party risks. All of them talk about the integration of how systems and processes and people work together. And inherently, there are a lot of organizations that have been built over time. And they've had interactions with different parties. And it's hard for us to see how do we map that? How do we stay ahead? How do we keep things in play? Now, if we look at DORA, they establish a very stringent oversight for third-party ICT providers. It's designated as a critical avenue by the European supervisory authorities. Okay, so they talk about if these third parties fall apart, it's critical. It breaks the system. All of these sort of things. Within the PRA and the subsections PS 2416 and the FCA subsection CPA 2623. Don't worry, everybody. The heavy stuff is on the screen, so you don't have to scribble it down. And we will definitely be giving you the slides at the back end of that. They outline very similar requirements for critical third parties or CPTs in the UK financial sector. But what we should note here is as this is going to progress, it's not necessarily going to stay in the UK financial sector. It's going to be those diverse third parties that interact in a vast amount of additional systems and processes. So they need to look at the life cycle of monitoring. They need to sort of dive a little bit deeper into these additional things. And I would say the key differences that we deal with here, especially in third party, is DORA formalizes a centralized EU oversight model, whereas in the UK, we've got a regulatory assignment responsibility to individuals and to firms to manage the third-party risk. So as you can see, those are two different ways of looking at it. One is the oversight, very mandatory, you have to do it, and the other one is much more passive. And I don't think from our perspective in the industry, and I can take it to you, Jason, you've seen plenty of PCI interactions, ISO interactions, where if you inherently do this from a passive perspective, you don't necessarily get the guidance. If you are risk adverse, what are you essentially going to get out of that? You're not going to get that insight. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's interesting, that kind of thing from the sort of the DORA perspective. There are sort of useful big parts and there are sort of areas which are sort of maybe sort of less useful. Like most of the sort of organizations that I speak to, I think would rather sort of happily be sort of given a sort of a list of, things that they need to sort of do as part of DORA. Whereas, when you look at sort of DORA, it kind of, ultimately the initial pillar is, ultimately have an ICT framework, which is sort of kind of unhelpful because it does, there's some guidance in terms of what that should be, what that should include, but it's not that sort of, mandatory in terms of actually sort of what's kind of required. But I think it's also kind of helpful in the sense that, ourselves in the UK, obviously, working in a sort of fairly regulated environment sort of anyway. So I think, trusting that we have those sort of ICT frameworks in place already is sort of useful. But my feeling from, sort of customers and sort of clients that we sort of talk to is, they really, just give us a list of what we need to do and they would quite happily do it. It's kind of having that sort of, I guess, sort of knowledge and kind of confidence really to sort of translate those sort of very high level, sometimes quite high level, sometimes low, but sort of ultimately, sort of turning that into something which is, as you sort of say, that's tangible, that we can measure and that we can sort of report on.
And I think this is very much the conversation. And as we see with where we are in this webinar, it is an oversight. There are so many different attributes that come into play when we deal with organizations themselves. As you do auditory mandates, you'll step in an organization and you'll find what has been demarcated in paperwork doesn't necessarily meet the needs of that organization. And that's a very hard one because they then have to adjust themselves in an approach to essentially meet those needs. And sometimes that even breaks additional systems for themselves. Now, the big thing that it comes into play that we've seen within DORA and the UK when it comes to incident reporting, for example, the DORA structure mandates a standardized and detailed reporting of ICT-related incidents. So basically, they say within 24 hours, you have to provide a root cause analysis and clear metric of the impacts of what has occurred in a breach. Whereas in the UK regulations with the FCA and the PRA, they ask for reporting of incidents to be promptly put into place. And they allow a lot more flexibility in terms of the thresholds, the timelines, and the details provided. Now, you look at those two measurements, and it's quite a difference between the two of what should be done and what shouldn't be done. And now you can just focus as to how that's going to relate to interactions with the two organizations. Because if we're talking about a breakage in a system, we know GDPR says, oh, you have to notify the ICO within 72 hours, but that's far from 24 hours when you talk about a breakage of any sort of system in the ICT world. So it's going to be interesting seeing how they map over those two sort of requirements in future. And the same when it comes to sort of the testing and monitoring. Now, in the financial institutions, when it comes to the EU, ICT providers need to conduct advanced resilience testing. Now, this includes what they talk about threat-led penetration testing, or TLPTs, but they talk about every 3 years. Now, this is slightly different again when we talk about the UK regulation from the FCA and the PRA. Within our frameworks, these are already mandated, so we do have to do these threat-led penetration testings, and it is much more concise, especially if you start looking at how CBES puts that to play in the banking infrastructure and how they talk about critical infrastructure. And PCI, for example, depending on whether or not your service provider talks a little bit deeper on how you test things and that. And we see that the banking institutions have applied a lot more pressure on those types of testings because they've realized that's where the essential financial risk and breakages lie, is in that play. Now, the frequency and scope between the two have tolerance levels and proportionality outlines. And once again, we're going to have to see how those are going to align. And will we get the answers in January? How do you feel? Is it going to be automatically something that's into play, Jason? Or do you think 6 months down the line, typical PCI version 1 to version 2 to version 3, the ISOs, what we talk about 2017 for the 27001, that is now 2022, and NISTs, we're going to go down the same route? Or what do you think?
Yeah, I think, that's kind of a little bit of an inevitability. Kind of looking through the sort of the evolution of the standards, kind of get the sort of the proposal sort of phase, and then, sort of following that, particularly sort of from DORA, there's got a consultation and some sort of technical, regulatory sort of technical standards that sort of underpin that. Really just to kind of, I guess, to sort of add some sort of meat onto the bones in terms of some of that sort of initial sort of proposal. And then from there, I get, it's sort of really a case of taking the sort of feedback through those sort of early phases and sort of applying that sort of back into the sort of the evolution of the sort of the regulatory standard or framework as is. But I think, as we both know, I think a lot of that sort of tends to, evolve in time, and, we look at sort of what becomes the, I guess, the sort of the accepted norm in certain cases, and, to a certain case sort of driven through, sort of what level of sort of discipline or sort of fines or whatever have sort of been applied, when people aren't sort of adhering to the standards. So I think, it's clear that these things evolve, and really that's just going to be a continual process. I think part of what we sort of talk about later is really, one of the challenges is really, sort of how do you keep up with that sort of evolution of the sort of standard, because it is a continuous sort of discipline almost in its own right. So there's a lot of work there. I mean, I think the evolution of the standards are a sort of a good thing, and when we look at sort of previous sort of standards, they probably sort of aimed at really just identifying what you have and then sort of keeping it sort of secure, and now we're sort of more into not quite assumed breach, but it's not a case of if you're going to be breached, it's going to be sort of when, and it's sort of really more about sort of how you respond, who you need to sort of alert, and sort of how you behave, and then sort of how you recover from that. So I think again, looking sort of even to the sort of the early sort of PCI standards, there's nothing really in there in terms of recovery and response, because the sort of the focus of the standard was really more about sensitive data loss or card data loss, whereas sort of now you look at the sort of operational resilience, that ultimately I guess we're sort of catching up. They're sort of far more sort of focused in being able to sort of maintain a credible business service. And I think that kind of goes back to sort of trust again. The sort of, you're going to trust that the service is going to be there from the consumer perspective and from an organization perspective, that you're going to be able to sort of operate that service effectively.
I think also, if we look at this and talking about the PCIs and that, is the key takeaway here is the frameworks that need to align towards DORA still goes into being that PS 2416 and the CP 2623. Now, they talk about operational resilience, and we've gone through this quite a bit now over and over and over again. They are not just fresh. And we know that one of them has recently, like the PS 2416, as in this month, progressed significantly and pushed for a December-January date. Now, that would mean you'll find that PS regulation is pushing to have the Bank of England, that sector, that financial relationship between the two architectures, comply, be a needing complicity. So they need to essentially stand together as of January going forward for this cross-border relationship of how things used to work are working right now. Because if you're in England and how it works, especially London, you'll find that certain parts of London isn't actually owned by London. It's a financial community, it's a cross-border section, the taxations differ, and all of this will come into play with the standards and regulations. So the deeper they go down, when the more we talk about the operation resilience within them and how they function with each other, the better the marriage is between the two independent architectures. And I think what we can do on the back of this, and maybe as a sideline item, just on an email for our team, and Katie, you can put this into a note, is to sort of give a key UK regulatory frameworks to align with DORA, quick overmap, just a couple of line items for everybody to see there. So I think let's progress a little bit from DORA as regulation and the alignment to more of what are the key differences and potential conflicts that we're going to step into here. Now, when we look about this, it's never an easy flow to understand how two specific streams are going to lie. Now, the regulatory scope for DORA, for example, has got a comprehensive focus on ICT. And we said this over and over. It's a risk management and operational resilience across financial sectors, and applies uniformly to financial entities and third-party ICT providers, once again deemed as critical. Now, those ICT providers, this is the thing that people need to understand. In the payment space, an ICT provider or functional provider can be linked to your production provider, can be linked to your retailer. It can be the back end of somebody providing you with a basic card swipe at your favorite retail store or your movie cinema. And that's the bigger element here. We're going to see that regulatory compliances are going to be pushed from the top down in these industries. In the UK, how we're going to see how this works is we're going to find that our frameworks, such as those within the FCA and the PRA, have a broader emphasis on operation resilience overall. And it's not just limited to the ICT risk. And it's going to be, is this going to be a subsection of this? Is this going to be in a play into that? And that essentially extends the scope for the UK entity wider into a wider variety of financial institutions. And the examples here, we can talk about crypto asset providers, fintech companies, basically beyond the traditional bank and insurer. Whereas in DORA, we don't necessarily see the same complication just yet. And I use the words just yet because, as we know, there's a catch-up game in this outset. So what I would say is the potential conflict that we're going to start seeing here is the UK firms operating in the EU might need to simultaneously address DORA ICT specific mandates and broader resiliences under the UK requirements and regulations. And what we're going to get there is a potential overlap and conflict. So this is the big thing that you need to do already now, is organizations need to focus of, if I'm doing cross-border, I need to focus on what I'm doing in the UK and what I'm doing in the UK. If I'm crypto or whatever I am, how is my cross-border going to be affected with this? Can they potentially stop me from doing business because I'm not adhering to their very strict ICT focus, but yet I have to be broader focus in the UK? And what does time and element come into play here? That's the big part. Now, another part about this is the standardization versus flexibility. And I think we've spoken about it quite a bit in between the two. We find that there's the one is very prescriptive with clear and uniform requirements across the EU for managing ICTs. Whereas you've got a standardized frameworks for incident reporting, third-party management, and resilience testings across all of these members. There are changes that occurs when we come to the UK regulations for the FCA, the PRA, BOE, where they adopt a more principle-based approach, emphasizing proportionality. And that you can already see we're talking about conflicts, and it's just going to grow, but it is how the entities essentially work greater towards each other. Now, I would say when we talk about standardization and versus flexibility, UK firms operating in both jurisdictions may face a challenge reconciling DORA's rigid outline with UK's more adaptive approach potentially leading to duplication of work and process, time and effort. And that is something that we know is extremely costly at the moment, because we spoke about that lovely paperwork living in a spreadsheet, and now I'm going to have 2 or 3 of these versions that I need to do. And how do I do it? How do I effectively monitor it? Do I have the time to do that? So am I duplicating, triplicating the amount of work that I need to do? And then we step into how that might lead to enforcement and the penalties. Within DORA, it relies on centralized oversight by the European Supervisory Authority, or the ESA, for critical ICT providers. So very focused on the critical ICT providers once again. And it's empowered with the regulatory back end of audits and imposed penalties versus strict methodology. So we need to look at how that's going to work. Now, strict penalties for non-compliances, including fines and restrictions on operations, that's standardized within the EU. We don't see that standardization just yet in the UK. There are some line items that play out. Now, in the UK regulatory PCA, FCA outside, we adopt a decentralized enforcement model with each regulatory overseeing authorities specifically monitoring a sector. So much broader once again, leaving it to somebody else to do the work to a certain degree, if I might say so. And if we look at the UK penalties for non-compliance, says it can be severe, and we can get fines. There's sanctions, reputational consequences, but the emphasis on this is for firm-specific enforcement tailored to their operations. So once again, I'm focusing on a firm, not an ICT. I'm focusing on the entity, not on the service provider. So if I have to say with enforcement, DORA centralized enforcement model may lead to conflicts when it comes to the UK firms, and especially how they must respond to multiple regulatory differences and expectations. So, and I can bring this back to the example because we both come from the PCI and the ISO worlds, where we found once the question was asked, who's going to do the penalty with me? Is it going to be the big Visa, MasterCard, Amex, Dynas entities that are going to fine me? And we found out, no, they're not. They're essentially going to be the ones that pass on the penalty towards the banks, and the banks will enforce this within the environment. And if you're a provider with a third party, it just sort of runs down the line. And I'm thinking we might get the same. What do you feel here? Are we going to start seeing the DORA lineups of penalties?
Absolutely, potentially. But I think, sort of in honesty, I mean, that's probably, a whole sort of another sort of webinar in its own right. And, just really, as you sort of talk through, sort of DORA and the sort of UK regulations, it just kind of goes to show, that probably we should have sort of, allocated sort of more time, to this, and, sort of how much really there is to sort of discuss on this topic.
So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to hand over to Jason a little bit more to discuss what we've seen in the market here, and especially from technological providers, and let him have a little bit of a word and let my voice just take a rest for a minute, because it's been a minute of monotone. Thanks, over to you, Jason.
Yeah, slightly conscious that we have sort of four minutes left. So just focusing a little bit on that sort of third party and sort of third party risk side of things. I guess there's a couple of sort of reasons sort of why that's important. In sort of 2022, 2023, third-party related issues were sort of really the leading cause of operational incidents that were reported to the FCA. So I think that sort of really gives you some sort of, sort of indication as to, going back to this sort of why now, we've sort of got to the stage where, those sort of third-party incidents are, largely the sort of the leading cause of sort of operational sort of issues. I think it's probably an easy an easy one to sort of reference CrowdStrike. We could probably all remember what we were doing when the CrowdStrike hit in the middle of this year. At least I hope we can. And for those that don't know, CrowdStrike pushed an update to its sensor, which kind of resulted in the blue screen of death to Windows systems across the piece. So major sort of outage. I think really what's kind of key, or what is a useful takeaway from this really, is it sort of almost the timing, and really organizations kind of really like to sort of work on sort of tangibles, I think. So actually sort of having something sort of tangible that both most of our audience as sort of customers, I guess, of services, can sort of really sort of point to that and say, well, look, here's an example. We all work in a sort of a heavily sort of regulated sort of environment, but a lot of the service providers and services that we take on are unregulated. So it's really sort of helping to sort of gain a bit of sort of traction sort of within those to sort of demonstrate, sort of how critical the sort of the third party supply chain is. So just sort of moving quickly on to the sort of the next slide. Again, a few more sort of stats that I got for you, sort of Corey, just really in terms of that sort of third party risk and sort of supplier piece. So back in 2018, when the FCA did some sort of technology resilience surveys, 80% of organizations kind of reported that they maintained a register of third parties. But interestingly enough, only half of those said that they actually maintained a comprehensive list, and they didn't really have a full handle on kind of who they did business with and who actually accessed their systems. So that was kind of quite an interesting sort of stat. So another sort of stat that sort of also came out from the same survey was, whilst organizations, nearly all of them reported that they'd sort of discussed cyber risk with their third party, only 2/3 of them actually included the sort of third-party response and recovery plans within their own sort of frameworks, and only 20% of those actually kind of included that in the testing. So I think when we look at sort of the DORA regulations and the sort of the FCA sort of resilience, you can sort of clearly see why those sort of two areas have been sort of really sort of brought to the fore. And for me, I kind of, what it sort of really says to me is, sort of organizations sort of really need to sort of shift from, ultimately a sort of a register of third parties and third party risk into a far more sort of in-depth sort of process where they're sort of mapping the services that they use as part of their sort of critical services, and in that sort of mapping, then sort of really sort of strengthening those, and then sort of moving on to sort of monitoring those. So I think sort of mapping, we probably kind of understand, really just being able to sort of clearly identify, the sort of the third parties and the sort of nth parties relationships, which we need in the supply of the sort of business services, but sort of strengthening really from a sort of contractual point of view, and that encompasses, sort of accessing sort of telemetry that we can measure maybe from our third parties through to, sort of closer communication, and really understanding what the third parties, what their SLAs and sort of response times are. And I think we like to sort of really talk about from the sort of Quod Orbis perspective, then being able to sort of monitor that sort of risk and of our sort of third-party suppliers, and we kind of really talk about the sort of the outside-in approach. So we're able to sort of monitor maybe sort of security scorecards and some of the other sort of technologies and tools around doing that sort of compliance monitoring piece. Thinking things like sort of BitSight. So that's the sort of the outside-in model. But we can also talk about the inside-out model. So continuous controls monitoring. Going back to that sort of contractual agreements with our third parties, if we can identify telemetry as part of that contract that they can sort of supply, and it's something that we can measure, then we can sort of really sort of build that into our sort of compliance view, and really then sort of help manage the sort of the third party compliance side of things a lot more closely, I think.
I'm just cautious of time for those that needed to drop off. We might be going over a little bit on our time sense, and please everybody note that this is a recording. So if you want to drop off and you need to drop off, please do so at the time. We're essentially going to touch on a couple of few additional points as we go towards the end of this, just making sure that you have everything in line. We will be providing the slides as well. And like we mentioned, any additional questions, you can please just follow that as well through to our section. So Katie, if you can bring up the last screen just quickly for everybody, just so that they can go and get the preferred email addresses. That will just help a little bit. And then we'll come back to this slide point. So everybody, those are the preferred measures. So if you want to contact Quod Orbis and you want to get in likes of touch with Jason, please feel free to contact them at contact@quodorbis.com. Similar for myself at Secon, feel free to reach out to our info team. They'll reach out with all the questions, collate anything that you need. So please take that up. You'll get the same snapshot on the end of the day so that you have that as well. So you can send that later on. And don't worry, we will send everybody that's been on the webinar itself a nice little oversight at the end of the day with everything in there. So if you've got anything additional, you'll have the measures of getting into that. But on that one, can we jump back to the previous slide, Katie? So the big thing, we've talked a lot about all of these sort of things at the minute. And as we can see on the screen, what is it that the UK firms need to do now from a strategic point of view, and sort of actioning the navigating due compliance aspect on things? It's the commonalities, I suppose. That's the big thing here, is you need to know where your oversights is, where your overlays are. You also need to understand what both regulatory frameworks mean to you, where those penalties and compliance comes into play. So be sure to do that. But essentially, you don't necessarily have to go into the heavy framework of doing that as well. There are tool sets, and I know Jason just briefly mentioned what the likes of Quod Orbis does, but tool sets like the CCMs give you a hands-on continual view of what's going on in your environment, which sometimes is a very heavy auditory process when it comes to paperwork or the likes of dashboards and systems that are not aligned to automation. And it's choosing which is the best fit for your organization, which is a big part that will streamline the processes. But then one thing that's come up in multiple sectors, and not just with DORA, not just with the FCA, not just with the likes of PCIs, is incident reporting and incident response. There's a big thing about how do we do that? And it's not just a single reporting structure. It needs to be the protocols align it. How do we automate those compliance processes? How do we report the data mapping? How do we report what has been stolen? Do we even know what's been stolen? Especially if we haven't looked at our infrastructure for a long time period and we do not know what's in our infrastructure. And both Jason and myself will find, and we've spoken briefly about this, where organizations have so many different people joining and leaving that people don't know what's physically in the environment from a technological perspective, what devices, what playabilities are there. And then a big one here is engage your ICT providers. You need to evaluate your third parties and their ability to meet regulatory regimes. That just means that go look at that contract that you've signed recently or 2 years back and check whether or not what's changed now is not going to impact you in the next year. Or also make sure that there is dual compliances in place where need to be in those contracts. So a refreshment of your contracts is going to be needed within the next 3 to 6 to 12 months. Find out where you stand. And I know some companies have gone through this recently, but it's again necessary now to look at that. And then the regulatory developments. As we're talking on this session, as everybody has joined the session, it is extremely important that you stay proactive, that you understand what these changes are. You need to monitor, look on your LinkedIn's, look at people talking about it, join groups, and that's a big thing. We actually have a group, and Katie will essentially put that out there for everybody to see, that talks about DORA. And this is the Financial Compliance and Digital Resilience Circle. It's something that's available to everybody on LinkedIn. Just go on there, type that up, click on the button, and as we get the updates, and as you can hear during the session, it's not as straightforward. Sometimes it's a lot of information in a very short time. And we would love to do all of this always within 45 minutes or less. But unfortunately, It's not possible. It's such an extreme amount of information, and we would love to make it easily accessible. But sometimes as well, each point has a bigger breakout. And if you want us to do so, please visit the sites, ask for it, and we will break those segments out for you into secondary or tertiary webinars when and so you need. Thank you so much for everybody's time on today's session. Jason, thank you so much for your insight, especially on the fact of the crowd strikes and everything in addition to that, and the time. I know that we've called you in short notice because your colleague couldn't unfortunately join us during the session. And everybody that has stayed, I know a lot of you needed to drop off. Thank you so much for your time and listening to the monotone orientated voices with a lot of information that gets dropped. Thank you so much. Jason, over to you.
Well, thank you for hosting, Corey. Sort of great job. I think sort of probably one final point that we sort of really had on the slide in the sort of the where next and what do we do now is we agreed to sort of really just start now, you know, and that's kind of sometimes sort of the hardest thing. And I also sort of put in the notes that, you know, kind of perfect is the enemy of good. You know, we sort of talk to customers who kind of delay because they want to sort of rework their controls or they sort of feel like they're not really measuring the sort of the right thing. So I think, you know, sort of ultimately sort of start now kind of has to be the sort of the biggest sort of takeaway. And particularly as we spoke about earlier, there's so much changing and so much really coming into force at the beginning of 2025 that, you know, no matter where you are, and you might actually be further along than you think. So definitely start now.
No, I completely agree with you, Jason. Apologies, my mic just decided to drop out, but luckily it's at the end of the session and not the beginning of the session. I do find that the perfect is the enemy of the good is such a prudent statement because you don't know where you are unless you start. Sometimes you're far ahead, sometimes you're way behind, but if you don't look, you really don't know. So please do start. And as we mentioned, if you need any assistance or just a little bit of a deeper look, feel free to contact us. There are technologies, there are systems, there are procedures, there are a lot of things out there that can help you, but it's prudent that you start now and ask the questions. What can help me? Where and how will it be effective for me? Thank you once again for your time.
Thanks,
Have a
everybody.
lovely afternoon.